The year was 1448, and the winds of autumn swept across the high, rolling plains of the central Balkans, carrying with them the scent of impending steel and the weight of a century of conflict. On the vast expanse of the Kosovo field, where the ghosts of a previous generation's defeat still lingered in the soil, two massive engines of war prepared for a final systemic collision. To the north, the Hungarian regent John Hunyadi led a coalition of crusaders, mercenaries, and Balkan exiles, driven by the desperate conviction that the Ottoman tide could still be rolled back from the Danube. Facing them was Sultan Murad II, a monarch who had briefly tasted the peace of retirement, only to be recalled by his generals to defend the empire he had spent decades consolidating. This was to be the ultimate test of two divergent military philosophies, pitting the heavy, shock-driven chivalry of the Hungarian plains against the disciplined, professional bureaucracy of the Janissary Corps and the mobile, provincial cavalry of the East. The stakes were absolute. For while the Crusaders sought to liberate the southern reaches of Europe, the Sultan intended to turn this ancient battlefield into a graveyard for the last great Western coalition. As the morning mist clung to the slopes of the surrounding hills, the fate of the Byzantine capital and the sovereignty of the Balkan kings hung in the balance. Welcome to our video on the Second Battle of Kosovo, the decisive engagement that extinguished the fire of the Crusades and solidified Ottoman mastery over Southeastern Europe for 5 centuries. The coordination of such massive hosts across the rugged terrain of the Balkans required more than just martial courage. It demanded a level of strategic planning and logistical foresight that few commanders of the age could master. This pursuit of the intricate systems behind the headlines of history is what drives our work, and we are able to provide this depth of analysis through the dedicated support of our community on Patreon and YouTube members. By becoming a supporter, you unlock a library of exclusive long-form content that explores historical theaters in unprecedented detail. This includes our comprehensive series on the naval and land battles of the Pacific War, the existential struggle between Rome and Carthage in the Punic Wars, and the generational conflict of the Reconquista. Our members also delve into the ideological fires of the Russian Civil War, the global complexities of the Spanish War of Succession, and the armored maneuvers across the North African campaign. Beyond these exclusive series, supporters gain entry to our private Discord community, access to our upcoming production schedule, early releases, and the right to vote on the subjects of our future documentaries. If you find value in our commitment to military and logistical history, we invite you to join us through the link in the video description. Your contribution ensures that we can continue to treat every faction and culture with the academic rigor they deserve. To understand the political and strategic web that led Hunyadi back to the Kosovo field, we must first look at the fragile state of the European frontier in the years following the disaster at Varna. In the wake of the catastrophic defeat at Varna 4 years prior, the geopolitical landscape of the Balkans existed in a state of suffocating Ottoman hegemony, as the European powers found themselves fractured and exhausted, while the Republic of Venice had opted for the pragmatism of a peace treaty in 1446 to safeguard its maritime trade. The remnants of the Byzantine Empire in the Peloponnese attempted a desperate, final reassertion of authority. The despots of Morea, Constantine and Thomas, sought to exploit the Sultan's perceived distraction by refortifying the Hexamilian Wall across the Isthmus of Corinth and launching raids into Ottoman-controlled Thrace. This defiance was met with a swift and ruinous response during the winter of 1446, when Murad II returned from his brief abdication to lead a punishing expedition that utilized heavy gunpowder artillery to shatter the Byzantine fortifications in a mere 5 days. The resulting sack of the Morea forced the Greek lords into a humiliating submission at Mistras, effectively neutralizing the southern flank of the peninsula and ensuring that no secondary front could be opened to distract the Sultan's main armies. Despite this atmosphere of consolidation, the embers of resistance remained burning in the Kingdom of Hungary, where the regent John Hunyadi refused to acknowledge the permanence of Ottoman expansion. By April 1448, Pope Nicholas V officially proclaimed a new crusade, framing the conflict not merely as a territorial dispute, but as an existential struggle for the heart of Christendom. This mobilization lacked the royal prestige of the previous decade, as no Polish monarch led the vanguard this time, leaving Hunyadi as the sole architect and financier of the enterprise. His strategic objective was ambitious and multi-phased. He intended to march south, link his professional forces with the Albanian guerrillas under Skanderbeg, and drive toward Thessaloniki before striking at the Ottoman capital of Edirne. It was a plan that relied entirely on the synchronization of disparate forces across a landscape defined by mountain passes and treacherous political allegiances. As the Crusader host began its descent toward the Danube, the political calculus of the Central Balkans became a lethal variable. In Serbia, the despot Đurađ Branković found himself in an impossible position between the encroaching Ottoman hammer and the crusading Hungarian anvil. Recalling the devastation of his lands during previous campaigns and harboring a deep-seated distrust of Hunyadi's long-term intentions, the despot refused to join the coalition, opting instead for a precarious neutrality. Meanwhile, to the west, the Albanian Lord Skanderbeg was embroiled in a bitter border conflict with Venice over the fortress of Dagnum, a distraction that the Sultan exploited by launching a massive incursion into Albania in the spring of 1448. The fall of the Svetigrad fortress after a grueling 2-month siege, caused by the tactical sabotage of the garrison's water supply, signaled that the Ottomans were already operating with a level of logistical coordination that Hunyadi had underestimated. The final collapse of diplomatic hope occurred when Hunyadi made the fateful decision to allow his troops to pillage the Serbian countryside as they marched through Brankovic's territory. This logistical necessity, born from a lack of formal supply depots, transformed a potential ally into a silent and vengeful enemy. Enraged by the violation of his lands, the despot of Serbia began a clandestine exchange of intelligence with the Sultan's camp, detailing the precise numbers and movements of the Crusader army. Crucially, Branković moved to seal the southern mountain passes with his own loyalist garrisons, effectively severing the line of communication between Hunyadi and the approaching Albanian forces. This maneuver left Skanderbeg isolated in the rugged highlands, unaware that the primary host he was meant to support was marching blindly toward a trap. The Crusader commander, emboldened by his veteran hussars and a belief in the superiority of Western shock tactics, crossed the border into Ottoman territory with a fragmented command structure, ignoring the strategic loop of his missing allies. As the two sides converged on the Kosovo plain, the Sultan also played a hidden hand, releasing the young Vlad Dracula from captivity in Edirne to seize the Wallachian throne and secure the Ottoman rear. The March of Empires had reached its zenith. There could be no more retreating. Battle was now a mathematical certainty. The Crusader army, numbering approximately 22,000 combatants, was a composite machine of Central European military traditions, heavily reliant on the tactical innovations of the previous decades. At its core stood 8,000 Hungarian and Transylvanian heavy cavalry, supported by 5,000 Polish men at arms and 3,000 Moravian riders led by the veteran commander, Peter. This formidable mounted force was designed for the shattering charge, intended to break through provincial lines and deliver a killing blow to the enemy center. However, the most significant technical asset in Hunyadi's arsenal was a contingent of 2 Zuzu Czech mercenaries who manned an extensive train of war wagons. These mobile fortifications, a legacy of the Hussite Wars, allowed the Crusaders to establish a defensible perimeter even on open ground, providing a stable platform for hand cannons and crossbowmen to repel cavalry counterattacks. Complementing this technical corps were 4,000 Wallachian infantry and archers under Vladislav II, alongside several thousand German and Bohemian foot soldiers tasked with maintaining the integrity of the Wagenburg. Facing this coalition was an Ottoman host of roughly 40,000 men, organized with the bureaucratic precision that had become the hallmark of Murad II's reign. The Sultan occupied the center with his personal household troops, the Kapikulu Sipahi heavy cavalry, and the elite Janissary infantry, who were increasingly equipped with matchlock firearms. Flanking the center were the provincial Timali Sipahis, with the Anatolian levies on the right and the Rumelian forces on the left, providing the Ottoman army with a massive numerical advantage in mobile light and medium cavalry. In a direct response to Western tactical developments, Murad also deployed a newly created corps of artillery wagoners, mirroring the Crusader use of mobile fortifications to protect his gunpowder units. The vanguard was composed of thousands of light Azab infantry, armed with maces and bows, whose primary function was to absorb the initial momentum of a Crusader charge and screen the movements of the more valuable professional units behind them. The battlefield was the Kosovo field, a broad and undulating plateau northwest of Pristina that offered little in the way of natural cover, but significant tactical advantages to whoever held the high ground. The most critical feature was the Chemirica Hill, a prominent elevation that dominated the central sector of the plain and offered clear lines of sight for the deployment of war wagons. To the south, the Lab and Sitnica rivers cut through the landscape, serving as the only reliable sources of fresh water for tens of thousands of men and horses in the dry autumn air. The grass was brittle, the soil hard-packed, and the visibility across the open steppe-like terrain was absolute. A single Czech gunner, checking the iron chains that bound his wagon to the next, could look out across the dusty horizon and see the shimmering of thousands of Ottomans' spears, realizing that there would be no room for maneuver once the lines collided. Command psychology on both sides was dictated by the ghosts of the past and the pressures of the present. John Hunyadi, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, was driven by a restless aggression and the political necessity of achieving a decisive victory to justify the Pope's investment. He remained confident in the weight of his armored knights, believing that a focused assault could decapitate the Ottoman leadership as it nearly had at Varna. Murad II, by contrast, operated with the calculated patience of a ruler who had already tasted victory and understood the value of the defensive. He was under no illusions about the lethality of the Hungarian charge, but he trusted in the discipline of his Janissaries and the depth of his formations to outlast the Crusader momentum. Hunyadi was fighting for a miracle. Murad was fighting to preserve a system. The morning of October 17th broke with a biting chill that clung to the tall grass of the Kosovo field as the two massive military systems began their initial probing movements. John Hunyadi, cognizant of the tactical advantages of elevation, ordered his vanguard of light hussars and scouts to seize the Chemirica Hill before the Ottoman light cavalry could establish a presence on the heights. For several hours, The dusty slopes of the hill became a theater of localized violence, where groups of Hungarian light horsemen clashed with Ottoman akinci in a series of running skirmishes that tested the resolve of both sides. By midday, the weight of the Crusader heavy cavalry forced the Ottoman scouts to withdraw toward the main body of Murad's army, allowing Hunyadi to occupy the high ground and deploy his 2,000 Czech war wagons in a formidable defensive semicircle along the crest. This initial success, however, carried a hidden and ruinous logistical cost. In their haste to secure the hill, the Crusaders were forced to concede the territory to the south, effectively surrendering control of the Lab and Sitnica rivers to the Ottoman host. As the sun began to set on the first day, the 22,000 men of the Crusader army found themselves in a strong tactical position, but with their access to fresh water severed, a constraint that would begin to degrade their combat effectiveness within hours. At dawn on October 18th, the silence of the plateau was shattered by the rhythmic thunder of drums and the blare of Ottoman trumpets as Sultan Murad II deployed his 40,000 men into their formal battle lines. Hunyadi's plan was a refined iteration of the strategy he had attempted 4 years earlier. As we saw in our coverage of the Battle of Varna, the regent believed that the Ottoman wings could be pinned down by secondary forces, creating a window of opportunity for a massive, concentrated cavalry charge to shatter the Sultan's center and decapitate the imperial command. To achieve this, the Crusaders launched simultaneous assaults against the Ottoman flanks. The Hungarian and Transylvanian heavy cavalry on the right wing hammered into the Anatolian Sipahis, while the Wallachian infantry and Moravian riders on the left engaged the Rumelian provincial levies. The air was soon filled with the screech of arrows and the sharp cracks of hand cannons as the lines of steel collided with a ferocity that reverberated across the plain. For 3 hours, the battle was an agonizing stalemate of attrition. The Ottoman Sipahis, utilizing their superior numbers and mobility, repeatedly gave ground only to wheel back and harass the Crusader flanks with volleys of arrows, attempting to lure the heavy Western Knights out of their cohesive formations. On the Hungarian right, the heavy cavalry finally began to gain the upper hand, pushing the Anatolian riders back toward their camp and threatening to envelop the Ottoman center. Seeing the wings begin to buckle under the weight of the Crusader pressure, Hunyadi decided the moment had arrived to commit his final reserve. He personally led the 8,000 Hungarian and Transylvanian heavy knights in a thunderous descent from Chemerica Hill, aimed directly at the heart of the Sultan's position. It was at this precise moment, with the Crusader charge reaching its maximum velocity, that the Ottoman system executed a calculated and devastating pivot. Murad II, watching the unfolding assault from beneath his imperial standard, ordered the elite Janissary corps in the center to execute a deliberate tactical withdrawal. The Janissary lines peeled away to the flanks, creating a wide, inviting gap in the Ottoman formation that appeared to be a collapse. The Hungarian knights, believing victory was within their grasp, surged forward into the void. This was the trap. As the Crusaders deep pushed into the Ottoman interior, they were suddenly halted by a line of Ottoman war wagons and concealed artillery pieces that unleashed a point-blank barrage of lead and stones. The momentum of the charge died instantly. The Janissaries, who had moved to the sides, now turned inward and struck the Crusader flanks with a synchronized fury. The scene narrowed to a single point of collision. A Czech gunner, his face blackened by soot and sweat, struggled to reload his wallpiece as a wave of Janissaries surged toward the gap in the Wagenburg. He could see the intricate embroidery on the robes of the approaching soldiers, hear the guttural shouts of their officers, and feel the heat of the fire that had begun to consume the wooden frames of the neighboring carts. He fired once more, the recoil nearly throwing him from the platform before the Ottoman infantry swarmed over the ramparts. The tactical zoom shifted back to the grand scale as the entire Crusader center became a chaotic mass of dying horses and trapped men. The collapse of the Crusader line was swift and irreversible. With their center pulverized and their flanks now isolated, the Hungarian and Polish barons realized the day was lost. Many of the high-ranking commanders were cut down where they stood, while others attempted to force their way back to the safety of the hill. By dusk, the cohesive Crusader army had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. John Hunyadi, seeing the slaughter of his finest knights and the total disintegration of his infantry screen, made the controversial decision to flee the field under the cover of the gathering darkness. He abandoned the remaining thousands of infantry and the Czech mercenaries, who were still holding the wagons on the hill, prioritizing his own survival and the potential for a future defense of Hungary. Throughout the night, the exhausted Czech and German infantry on Shemrika Hill repelled repeated Ottoman assaults, their war wagons chained together and spitting fire from every embrasure, created a ring of iron that the Sultan's cavalry could not breach. However, without their commander or the support of their cavalry, their situation was a mathematical certainty. At sunrise on October 19th, the final phase of the battle began. The Janissaries, reinforced and refreshed, launched a massive, coordinated breach of the Wagenburg. The remaining Crusaders, suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, fought to the last man. By midday, the sounds of combat finally faded, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the systematic tallying of the dead. The Second Battle of Kosovo had ended, and with it, the era of the great Crusader offensives had come to a ruinous conclusion. Over 15,000 Crusaders lay dead or dying on the field, while the Ottoman casualties, though significant, were easily absorbed by the vast resources of the Sultan's empire. The plain was once again a graveyard of Western ambitions. The butcher's bill on the Kosovo field was staggering. Estimates suggest that nearly 15,000 Crusaders were slaughtered or captured, with the majority of the professional Hungarian and Polish infantry being annihilated where they stood. While many of the lower-ranking soldiers were executed or sold into slavery, the Ottoman tradition of ransoming high-born prisoners saw several Hungarian barons return to Budapest in the following months. Murad II, ever the pragmatic administrator, used these captives as diplomatic leverage to further destabilize the Hungarian court. The defeated commander, John Hunyadi, did not escape unscathed. During his desperate flight northward through the Serbian wilderness, he was intercepted not by Ottoman patrols, but by the men of Đurađ Branković, the Serbian despot, settling the score for the pillaging of his lands during the Crusader advance. Imprisoned the regent in the fortress of Smederevo. It would take a payment of 100,000 gold florins and several months of arduous negotiation for Hunyadi to regain his freedom. This humiliation signaled the end of Hunyadi's career as an offensive strategist. For the remainder of his life, he would adopt a strictly defensive posture, focused on fortifying the Danube against the inevitable Ottoman advance. In Wallachia, the immediate political fallout was equally chaotic. Vladislav II, having survived the battle, rushed back to his capital only to find the young Vlad Dracula occupying the throne with Ottoman support, while Vladislav managed to depose the young pretender in a brief civil war. The victory was hollow. In 1449, Murad launched a retaliatory raid that turned much of Wallachia into a charred wasteland, enslaving thousands and ensuring the principality remained a cowed vassal of the Sultan. The strategic legacy of the Second Battle of Kosovo was the finality of the crusading movement in the Balkans. The defeat proved that even with the latest Western military technology and the tactical brilliance of a commander like Hunyadi, the Ottoman system was too resilient to be uprooted by a single coalition. This reality left Skanderbeg isolated in the Albanian mountains, although the Sultan would lead a massive army of 40,000 men to besiege the fortress of Crusaders in 1450. The campaign would end in a humiliating Ottoman withdrawal after 6 months of scorched earth guerrilla warfare. However, Skanderbeg's survival was a local triumph that could not alter the broader geopolitical collapse. The open loop of the Crusader resistance was finally closed. With no credible threat remaining from the west, the path to the Bosporus was now clear. Murad II would not live to see the final fruit of his labor. Dying of a stroke in early 1451 after 27 years of rule across 2 reigns. He left behind a consolidated empire, a professionalized army, and a successor who harbored no desire for the cautious diplomacy of his father. The young Mehmed II ascended the throne with a singular obsidian focus. The strategic victory at Kosovo had ensured that when the new Sultan eventually turned his cannons toward the ancient walls of Constantinople, there would be no Christian host marching to the rescue. The shadow of the Ottoman house now stretched from the Danube to the Aegean, waiting for the moment the last Roman bastion would fall. With the road to the southern Balkans now permanently secured and the Hungarian threat neutralized, the young Sultan Mehmed II turns his gaze toward the ultimate prize. In our next episode, we will cover the final collapse of the Roman world in the monumental siege of Constantinople in 1453. To ensure you do not miss the conclusion of this era, consider subscribing to the channel and activating the notification bell to stay updated with our latest historical deep dives. We extend our gratitude to our patrons and YouTube members whose continued support allows us to maintain this level of academic rigor and logistical detail. You can join them and access our exclusive series and Discord community by following the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.